Então tá. Bom trabalho, Isa. Vamos lá, então. Queria agradecer mais uma vez a presença de todos os nutiaços e hoje novamente com uma grande convidada, um grande nome da psicologia arquetípica, Mary Watkins, né? É um grande prazer recebê-la, Mary. Há muito tempo que eu queria estender esse convite a você e, por uma ironia dos deuses, quis que a pandemia nos oferecesse essa possibilidade de convidar pessoas que a gente admira para estar aqui junto com a nossa comunidade brasileira. Então, para mim, particularmente, é um grande prazer ter você conosco. A Mary é professora na Pacifica Graduate, ela é especializada nos temas psicologia da liberação, comunidade, questões indígenas, no campo da ecopsicologia, autora de vários livros, trouxe alguns aqui para mostrar. Waking Dreams, um dos primeiros livros que ela escreveu. The Invisible Guests. Esse livro que gentilmente ela nos forneceu a tradução agora no chat, ela pôs ali o PDF, é um ótimo livro. E esse livro também, que a Mary escreveu com Ed Casey. E eu acho que a Mary lançou um livro novo agora, que talvez ela possa depois falar com a gente. Mary, um prazer te recebê-la, fique à vontade, espero que a gente tenha um bom encontro. Muito obrigado.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Marcus. It's really quite a joy to be with all of you. One of the effects of the pandemic is feeling certainly like one's wings are clipped. And I would love to be there with you in person, but I'm very happy to talk with you today. Some of you may not know my very special connection with Brazil, which was that 35 years ago, I went to the Northeast Brazil, to Natal, to adopt my first daughter. She's now 35, and I have two beautiful Brazilian-Mexican grandsons, 4 and 6. So I've had the opportunity to visit in Brazil a few times and always have learned so much. And indeed, my life was changed in 1985, not only by my love and love from my daughter, but by meeting the work of Paulo Freire. And I'll speak a little bit about that. But I wanted to just give you a little context for the talk today. This period of the pandemic has been a steep learning curve with many issues of our societies bringing up deep psychological issues. And today I'm going to be focusing on part of a talk called Keeping the Door Open in a Time of Walling In and Walling Out, Pandemics, Policing, Prisons, and Forced Migration. I hope that by the end we'll see that these are not really separate issues, but really take us to the heart of what kind of orientation we're going to have toward the world, toward our neighbors, toward our own psyche. And I'm going to try to link the propensities of walling out and of opening doors, not only to things in our society, but to psychological orientations. So I was introduced to the work of Jung out of crisis when I was about 19. I was beginning to go into a depression and I had many, many waking dreams. And I began to read Jung and could place my own experience in what he was talking about as active imagination. And so began to study him as deeply as I could. I was living at the time in Boston and was introduced to the work of James Hillman one morning by my Jungian analyst. because was working on an inpatient psychiatric unit, and I had gone into the rooms of patients to check them during the night, and one of them had tried to kill herself. And so in my trying to intervene in that situation, I came face to face with suicide. And I tracked James Hillman's book, Suicide and the Soul, down, and felt, this was in 1973, and was incredibly moved by his openness to the kinds of very difficult images we have at incredibly challenging moments of our lives, including those where there's suicidality. So I made a application to the Jung Institute in Zurich and was accepted, and went there to study with him, and was very graced to hear the lectures that became Revisioning Psychology and The Dream and the Underworld. I left after a year because I had interest in also phenomenology and existential psychology, and went then to study at Duquesne. But I continued really being deeply mentored by James Hillman, and developed a deep friendship that means quite a lot to me. And in 1981, he published, as you know, The Thought of the Heart and the Soul of the World, where he really tried to warn us against sequestering the soul into our interiority. And his intent was to restore a much more ancient idea of the soul as being in each and every. And that was very confluent with my own sense that many parts of depth psychology were over-focusing on the intrapsychic, and we're ending up in really decontextualizing individuals from the sociocultural, political, economic, and ecological surrounds of their life, upon which our well-being is interdependent. So it was out of this atmosphere in 1985 that when I started trying to learn everything I could about Northeast Brazil, that I met the work of Paulo Freire. And as I've said many times, I felt that his work was the missing half of depth psychology. And I've tried since 85, so this is a long time now, 35 years, to place liberation psychologies into dynamic conversation with depth psychologies, including psychoanalysis. So my topic today brings us to things that I think we're deeply concerned about. And I'll start by saying how this talk evolved. 3 weeks before the pandemic, I was going to what is called ICE Detention Center in Adelanto. For the last 20 years or so, my focus in community work has been around forced migration, particularly from Mexico to the US, but also in policies worldwide that have created an incredible proliferation of walls between countries and even neighborhoods. I'm going to switch now to a PowerPoint so I can go this way. So you can see that in our world, these red lines are the walls that we have been creating really very recently, and a lot of them, sadly enough, modeled on the wall between that the US built at the US-Mexico border. So this was the place that I was that particular day, and it's the place before the pandemic, I was going every other week to do psychological forensic evaluations of asylum seekers. And that's something I've been doing since our president, Trump, has been in power. I was quite involved with asylum seekers beforehand, but as you may know, the US has created a proliferation of detention prisons throughout the United States, and people are in these often for 2, sometimes even more years, awaiting their cases to be adjudicated. That particular day, I was, just a second, yeah, I'm gonna go back. I was talking to a person from Cameroon. I was talking to 2 people from Cameroon, actually, who had traveled to Brazil and then to Colombia and up through the difficult Darien Gap in Honduras and up Guatemala, Costa Rica, Mexico, and then were stopped at the border and had to stay in Tijuana for some months before having their asylum application accepted, and then were placed into prison. And I'd be very curious in the chat section what you know about how Africans are transversing Brazil to begin this very long and difficult trek. But the woman I was seeing had endured unbelievable torture and rape by prison guards in her home country, and really under only threat of death had to leave her children to come to the United States. And on this long path had encountered the worst kinds of things that human beings can do to other human beings. I won't detail them, but I know you know some of their forms. So I was in my car driving home. It takes about 3 hours to drive from this detention center back to my house, and I'm grateful for the time because the stories are so difficult to hear. You're essentially trying to hear a person's story of their life in 3 hours, to put it together, to move the heart of a judge. And I was thinking back over the kinds of things she had described to me: being made to eat her own feces, being raped until people thought she was dead, and then continued to be raped after that. When on the news came the daily onslaught of the things that the Trump administration has been doing in our country, that particular day, the administration had been successful in turning back environmental protections that had forbidden the releasing of toxic chemicals and particularly heavy metals into streams and rivers in the United States. And so the news was saying that now corporations and industries would be able to do this once again. So I was thinking, how do I put these experiences together of people being tortured and dealt with in such horrible ways, and our onslaught to kill, you know, even rivers and streams, and then obviously the horrible consequences that heavy metals and toxics have on animals and human beings, on our central nervous system. When all of a sudden, the word necrophilia came into my head, and I was thrown back several decades, really quite a few decades, into when I was studying the work of Erich Fromm. And I realized with a kind of punch in my stomach that his work that was conceived out of the horrors and violence of the Holocaust were in a way uncannily applicable to our present time. So I just want to share a little bit of this. He tried to describe necrophilic character as a passionate attraction to all that is dead, decayed, putrid, and sickly. It's the passion to transform that which is alive into something unalive, to destroy for the sake of destruction, the exclusive interest in all that is mechanical. It's the passion to tear apart living structures. He said that the necrophiliacs have the conviction that the only way to solve a problem of conflict is by force and violence. For them, the past is sacred, nothing new is valuable, and drastic change is a crime against the natural order. And these tendencies are very prevalent in my own country right now, and I suspect in yours as well. Necrophiliacs feel empty, and so they attempt to hoard, consume, and amass excess wealth and power, and to fill emptiness with sadism and aggression. And he described this orientation to be the most malignant form of authoritarian or sadomasochistic character struggles. And during this time, I was also, as you may be, trying to understand the societal underpinnings that allow fascism to be gaining ground in the United States. And so this was very helpful to me. He describes those with an authoritarian character or a masochistic character as having an intense desire to control, to hurt, and to humiliate others. We have a daily recitation in the United States of attempts by the president to humiliate others who have different ideas from his own. They're excessively narcissistic. For the narcissist, Fromm says there's only one reality, and that's his own thought processes, feelings, and needs. A very dangerous kind of leader indeed, very out of step with the lived experience of people that he's in the position to help, but is failing to do so. This kind of person is malignantly aggressive, describing all opponents as losers, and as encouraging violence, particularly in the face of losing. And this is a shadow right now that is covering the United States. Fromm was very clear that when Hitler began to understand the totality of his loss, that he ordered farmhouses and storehouses of food, museums, historic buildings to be burned. And not in other countries, but in Germany. And we have a great fear now in the United States of the violence that is potential upon this upcoming election. So authoritarian populism or neo-fascism appeals to parts of a society that tend toward necrophilia, who wish to restore an idealized past, perhaps not an idealized past for everyone, but for those particular people in control. And as we know, it's undergirded by racism, as is colonialism. And they tend to not understand how our fates are really interlinked, how what they're doing has consequences, destructive consequences on others. In the US, this is linked to a really severe form of radical individualism that has haunted us from the beginnings of immigration to the US, where collective forms of solidarity are held as suspect, where government interventions to curb and regulate issues that mitigate against the common good are rejected as un-American, as unfair, as intruding upon personal liberty. So in particular, efforts to bridle unregulated capitalism, to really try to rein in what we are experiencing here as egregious income inequalities, that have resulted in horrific disparities in healthcare, housing, and education. And I'm also going to say terrific disparities in hunger and satiation, where a quarter of our children right now are going hungry every day. These are seen as intrusions into rights for liberty. And the quote-unquote victims are seen as those who are interrupted from pursuing their own aims when they conflict with others. I.e., the victims are those who are being asked, through variations in taxation, for instance, to give up more of their excess profits, instead of the victims being the ones who are trying to make daily life work despite the lack of resources to be able to do that adequately for their families. So I threw myself back into the reading of Erich Fromm when 3 weeks later the pandemic hit. And we know from history that in times of pandemic, historically, cities have locked their gates. People have locked their houses, and they've tended to see the virus as a foreign invader against whom they're helpless. One of our writers, Sonia Shaw, has asked us to emphasize instead that we're not powerless, that we have the power of collective cooperation, the cooperation of wearing masks, of socially distancing, all the kinds of choices we make not to put others at harm. And that if I put this into Fromm's language, this collective cooperation would be a way of having our door open to others, to extend a biophilic orientation to what's necessary right now. But instead, unfortunately, while many are doing that in the US, we see necrophilic tendencies being played out all around us. Some groups being valued more than others, a willingness by some to sacrifice the lives of those they devalue. We saw this in sending meat packers back to work into factories that were severely contaminated by COVID, by some sectors being willing for the virus to sweep through nursing homes and sacrificing the elderly, and a general rhetoric around getting back to work despite the stunning consequences. This week we see as some schools went back to work, the death already of beloved teachers, and hopefully not students, but we worry about that. So those who are picking up the voice for the importance of individual liberty are arguing that they need to go where they want, to not wear a mask, to refuse to social distance, to carry arms into the square to defend themselves against those who would ask them to think about the welfare of the collective. And I'm sure you've seen some of these pictures which connect this necrophilic orientation and this stress on individual liberty with pre-Civil War reality. That's the Confederate flag in the United States. And where words like tyranny and liberation are getting used in very opposite ways. And where we're seeing people who are trying to, public health people who are trying to help us keep safe, and governors like Gretchen Whitmer, actually seen by this part of the population as authoritarians like Hitler. So for us, it's a quite challenging time, and I look forward to hearing from you how this is playing out in Brazil. But one of our important African-American writers and theorists, Ibram Kendi, in May, wrote an important article that differentiated between the freedom to and the freedom from. He's seeing these as two essentially different conceptions of liberty that have plagued us since slavery. It says the slaveholder, or those with slaveholder consciousness, assert freedoms that harmed others, the freedom to enslave, to disenfranchise, to exploit, to impoverish, demean, to silence and kill the demeaned. The freedom to. So essentially the freedom to, he says, is the freedom to harm. So in coronavirus terms, that means that each person has the freedom to infect others. And he contrasted this sharply with the freedom from, which values communal freedom. Freedom from, he says, freedom from slavery, from disenfranchisement, exploitation, from poverty, from all the demeaning and silencing and killing, the freedom from harm, which is to say, in coronavirus terms, the freedom from infection. So he puts this rather starkly, the freedom to infect versus the freedom from infection. While we see those two playing out, we have to remember the other side of what Fromm was trying to bring forward, which was a biophilic orientation and ethics that springs from our love of life, our sense of its sacredness, of each person and each animal, each tree, river, the earth itself having a sacredness, and our commitment to protect it really out of our love for it. He says, a love of life is contagious. It communicates itself without words. Like I think of the music that you all were playing, the beautiful Brazilian music before we started, which communicates this kind of contagious love of life. It can be observed, Fromm says, in the whole atmosphere of a person or group, warm, affectionate contact with others during infancy, a freedom and absence of threats, and teaching it occurring by example rather than by preaching of the principles conducive to inner harmony and strength. Love for life, he says, will develop most in a society where there is security, in the sense that the basic material conditions for a dignified life are not threatened. Justice, in the sense that nobody can be an end for the purposes of another. And freedom, in the sense that each man has the possibility to be an active and responsible member of society. Well, these are aspects, obviously, of our societies that we need to continue to work on, such that love for life, or what Paulo Freire called to make it the work that we do, that hopefully will make it easier to love in our societies. So as the pandemic hit in the US and also in Brazil, as I understand it, the call to address more deeply racial violence erupted upon our scenes. And I want to reflect a little bit on some of the roots of policing and of prisons in the US and a little bit in Brazil. I just know a little bit about it, and hopefully you'll take me more deeply into it. But we need, in order to create a more biophilic orientation, we need to better understand the freedom to violently uproot people, as in forced migration or in slavery and servitude, to prohibit neighbors from helping one another, the freedom to surveil, police, and falsely imprison subjugated populations, and to keep out those deemed undesirable. So how did this take root? I like to go back to the idea of the commons, which is dated, even before the 1500s in England and Ireland, Scotland. And it referred to lands that were used and sustained for the common good, land that wasn't owned by an individual, but land that was taken care of by the community. To be part of the commons didn't mean that you could take everything you wanted and exhaust the commons, but rather that you had obligations and duties to ensure that the commons was self-sustaining and capable of sharing for people that needed the fruits of the commons, the seeds of the commons, the area to pasture their animals. According to Gary Schneider, the commons was an ancient mode of both protecting and managing the wilds of self-governing regions. The commons is a level of human society that includes the non-human. So in England and Ireland, we began to see what's called the enclosure of the commons. And I really don't know how this played out in Portugal. I'd be interested in that. Couldn't find much about it, although there were some movements in the present to establish commons in Portugal. But I want to talk to you about, in my own work in studying walls throughout the world, I spent some time in Derry, and it's a very good wall to speak a little bit about, to just clarify the structure of colonialism. Oftentimes we think about colonialism as something that European countries first practiced quite far away in the Southern Hemisphere. But in fact, the earliest instance of the English, also the Scottish, enacting colonialism was in Ireland, right next door. And people from England and some Scottish settlers came to Derry, and they displaced Irish off of their own land and took a part of land, built a wall around it, and then forbid the Irish to come in except under certain times and certain conditions. The Irish taken off their land, lost many of their means of livelihood and certainly their land, and so they were put into servitude for the British. The British then razed many of the forest and used the wood to build the ships of the British Navy, and the customs and religion of the Irish were outlawed. So this was an example of walling people out who had actually belonged on their land. And I'm going to give an example of what these periods were like when what was a commons was enclosed. And I'll take an example that occurred in England in 1847. The Bishop of Meath describes it this way. Wait just a second, let me see if I can. No, okay, I'm going to go back a little bit. He says, 700 human beings were driven from their homes in one day and set adrift on the world to gratify the caprice of one who before God and man probably deserved less consideration than the last and least of them. The horrid scenes I then witnessed, I must remember all my life long. The wailing of women, the screams, the terror, the consternation of children, the speechless agony of honest, industrious men, wrung tears of grief from all who saw them. I saw officers and men of a large police force who were obliged to attend on the occasion, cry like children at beholding the cruel sufferings of the very people whom they would be obliged to butcher had they offered the least resistance. The landed proprietors in a circle all around and for many miles in every direction warned their tenantry with threats of their direct vengeance against the humanity of extending to any of them the hospitality of a single night's shelter. And in little more than 3 years, nearly a fourth of them lay quietly in their graves. Now, I want to underline here both the presence of the police in supporting the people who were enclosing the commons, but also the outlawing by force of hospitality and mutual aid. In the United States right now, this is happening again on our border, where those who are active in putting out water and food for migrants coming across the border are actually being prosecuted and put into very long lawsuits and needing to pay fines and are at threat of being imprisoned. And this I say because as people from England came to the US, they brought with them some of these ideas. Essentially, as the commons were enclosed, people from the countryside were forced into the cities and became the workers in the initial sites of industrialization. And when they couldn't find a place in the cities, they were deemed vagrant, and they were taken into prisons and turned into prison labor. And many of those prison laborers were then sent to the quote-unquote New World as indentured convicts. Now, I'm gonna go a little quicker now. So in the U.S., we had in New England people in the towns and cities who were called warners, who would go around and figure out each day who was coming into the city, who didn't belong there. This would have been in the 1700s, and those people were given notice that they could not stay in the city, that they needed to continue to move on because the city didn't want to become responsible for vagrants who were poor. And this was exactly what had happened in London and various cities in England. Even amongst the Puritans, if a person came into your village that others didn't know, you were not allowed to offer them hospitality. Now, this may seem like very long ago, but these kinds of psychic and social orientations still haunt us in the US in terms of how we're dealing with immigrants in need of coming into our country. The first police really in the US grew out of slave patrols. And some people will even argue that some of the policing in England grew out of the slave patrols that began in the Caribbean and in the south of the US. And those slave patrols were given the task of imprisoning slaves who were trying to learn to read and write, imprisoning slaves who were trying to escape, and also slaves that were not conforming to the desires of their masters. And in just a little bit of research I've done in Brazil, it looks as though some of your early policing also served the function of policing slaves, and that even slaveholders could take slaves to the police to have the police punish them, usually by lashing, and then returned, hopefully more able to accept the will of the master, according to the master's wishes. These slave patrols also in the United States patrolled poor Southerners, poor white Southerners, and also, as they had in England, had this function of taking those who were deemed to be undeservedly poor and imprisoning them, and then selling them out into convict labor, a practice that was continued in the US after the end of slavery. And I believe was a practice also in Brazil, to put people in prison, to work, oftentimes alongside slaves early on. In the south of the US also, we had Texas Rangers who policed the new border that was created very suddenly in 1848, where a huge swath that was Mexico was all of a sudden deemed to be part of the US. And Texas Rangers, a form of police, were given the job of creating really terror in the way that the Ku Klux Klan had created terror. In fact, many early police and early members of the Texas Rangers were members of the Ku Klux Klan, and they would be involved in paramilitary forces that lynched African Americans, and at the border, Mexicans who the year before had owned property and were governing that region, and now were being terrorized to move back across the border. The Texas Rangers really have morphed into what we now call in our country the Border Patrol, or ICE, and this is one of the largest policing groups in the United States that has grown exponentially since 9/11, which we celebrate today, in sorrow at the difficulties the US created around the world after that event, but also the difficulties created it in our militarizing our southern border more than any border in the world. So I'm going to skip ahead. This is a picture from Rio, which you all probably know, which has its own kind of walling in and walling out. The present sort of scholarship on policing in the US as we face into efforts to defund the police are trying to bring into public consciousness the way in which policing in the US has always been policing what we call essential workers, and primarily Black and brown bodies, that the kind of ideas that the upper classes and the middle classes have about the police are extremely different from those who are actually at the brunt of policing. So I had a few slides earlier on about here in our country, how this broke out at the death of George Floyd. And as I began to read about Brazil recently, I realized that a week before George Floyd was murdered by the police here, that you had your own murder of this young boy, and that it began your own movement. Perhaps didn't begin it, perhaps this is just another chapter in it, as is the case in the US. So I've seen pictures for some of the massive demonstrations in your country about policing. So I'm going to skip ahead and end with some words from Jacques Derrida, who really inspired me as I've been working on the US-Mexico border. He says that, in essence, each of us have a heart of our home, a heart of our own home. And I think we can think about the home as metaphorical as well as literal. But he says that there's a room inside of our home. So I take this in our psyche, in our heart, and in our home. a room that we only have access to when we open our door to the stranger, that without welcoming the stranger, and I believe he would agree, like welcoming the stranger in a biophilic way, the host, he says, is actually a hostage in his own home. While the host is inside, without inviting the guest, he's on the outside of the inside of his own home. That only the invited guest can host him into the inside of his own home. So this is where I want to end right now, and open it into some dialogue with you about how these issues of walling in, of walling out, of policing in prisons are affecting you all in Brazil. It's really noteworthy that in the history of England, capitalism, industrialism, and the rise of prisons and the rise of policing happened at exactly the same time, and created this legacy that I think we're still sadly witnessing. All right, Marcus, you are going to host the discussion for us. Thank you.
Obrigado, Mary.
Thank you.
Muito difícil ouvir a tua palestra, porque ao mesmo tempo a gente reconhece quase como um espelho a realidade brasileira. E de alguma maneira, todas essas questões que você pontuou na tua fala, elas estão, eu diria, totalmente explicitadas no Brasil, particularmente nesses 2 anos de governo Bolsonaro. Então, é assustador o quadro. Eu queria te fazer uma pergunta para a gente começar o debate. Como foi que nós chegamos aqui? Como foi que nós chegamos nessa condição? Talvez politicamente a gente consiga entender isso, pela via econômica e social a gente consiga, mas eu queria te perguntar como entender isso psicologicamente. O que está acontecendo tanto nos Estados Unidos como aqui no Brasil, na Hungria? O que está constelado de alguma maneira que nos permitiu chegar numa situação tão necrofílica, né? Essa necropolítica? Você tem uma hipótese para isso?
Well, this is, of course, huge, and I think there are many, many tributaries. We can't, the reason I always put IES on the end of psychology is because we can't speak in the singular. Many of us in this conversation come from very different socioeconomic, political histories. So I can only speak of my own experience and of the way in which I believe that got inscribed by certain aspects of depth psychology, which needed to be addressed through a more liberatory perspective. So here in the US, it's quite possible as an upper middle class person to live a very insulated life. And you can go to university and you can study psychology and even the history of depth psychology and not be challenged in the way that it's necessary that we are challenged to listen to how differently other people are living, what their daily lives are like, what their values are, their visions, and the ways in which upper middle class and those with what I call excess wealth, the effects of their ways of living on the everyday life of people. So we are no longer holding slaves, but there are things that we do in the way that we live our life that create situations of servitude for others. Now, when I learned depth psychology and even studied phenomenology, the work of Frantz Fanon was nowhere to be seen. I only began to read him about 20 years ago and realized he should have been taught at Duquesne when they were teaching phenomenology, should have been taught at my university in studying depth psychologies, because he was a reader of Jung and Freud, a reader of Lacan, but because he was of African descent from Martinique, living in France, and then became part of the liberation movement in North Africa, his work was excised from depth psychology. Now, his work is critical to us understanding the ways in which depth psychology was used in North Africa and other places in the world in very negative ways that supported colonialism. And I teach it at Pacifica his work in great detail, because we can fall in love with Jung, but we need to understand how some of the ideas that are given to us as being universal are really quite particular and are talking about a particular historical time and a particular set of people, socioeconomically. So that when we begin to get that sense that the psychologies that we love and we study are just several among many, many psychologies that are possible and that have been offered to us from indigenous ways of being and knowing, then we begin to see that our job is to learn how to be in dialogue with people and to learn how to work in participatory fashion. And this is where Freire, your own scholar activist, his work is so critical. He himself, yes, he was hungry when he was growing up, but he came from a middle-class family, and he was chastised by his wife Ilsa one night. I love this story where he went to work with people who I think were planning a strike, and he told them how to organize and what the situation was and how they should think about it. And as he was driving home with Ilsa was feeling out of sorts with him, and he said, "What did I do? I went there, I told them what their situation was, I told them what they should do. Why are you so upset with me?" And she said, "Paolo, you didn't listen to them. You didn't ask them what they knew about the situation. You didn't ask them how they imagined traversing through it to a better place." So this kind of dialogue, takes real effort on our part. So I've tried to be, in our program at Pacifica on community liberation, indigenous and eco-psychology, to hold up what I call the public work of psychology, which is not over and against private practice, but which is to say, psychologically minded people are needed in many different circumstances throughout our societies, not as people who come and teach, but as people who can join in solidarity and who can listen and learn. And as they're involved in the situations that have caught people's interest because of their criticality, they can offer help along the way and perhaps be challenged to learn new things that they don't already know that may be needed. And I'll give you for instance of that. In Colombia, there's an incredible group of psychologists from the university who wanted to help migrants from the countryside who were displaced by the paramilitary forces there. And they went out of the university and out of their psychotherapy offices, and they formed relationships with people who had undergone, again, unspeakable trauma, torture, death of many family members, and now we're living in the city, you know, very poor and difficult to navigate the city. And yes, the psychologists had certain ideas about what these people might need because of what they'd gone through, their trauma, etc. But they were committed to listening first. And what they found was that there was one thing that was causing great psychological suffering that they had not anticipated and which they didn't know how to navigate. And that was that many had had family members killed by paramilitary, family members killed because they were associated with an armed group that they were not even members of, and they had not taken up arms, and they were not involved in the conflict, and yet they were dishonored by the way that people had labeled them. And they wanted the psychologists, whom they are seeing now as people of privilege, and that was accurate, to go to the Supreme Court to figure out how to clear the names of their fallen relatives. And they said only then would they be able to sleep. So the psychologists, not knowing exactly how to do that, had to learn with the help of lawyers how to go about creating that campaign with people. So I think your question is a challenge to us to walk back and forth between private practice and public practice in ways where we can learn more and then be able to live our lives, our professional lives, our private lives, more in conjunction with what we've come to know. That's a very long-winded answer. Thank you, Marcus.
Ótimo. Obrigado, Mary. Vamos abrir para as perguntas, tá? Daniel Iago, quer fazer uma pergunta para ela, Dani? Você está aí? Daniel?
Estou aqui. Mary, que
favor.
prazer conhecê-la. Agradeço muito a sua fala, né? Eu acabei reconhecendo uma série de questões, obstáculos, né, presentes na minha própria formação na medida que eu fui te escutando. E neste momento, tudo certo com áudio? Eu vou colocar o vídeo, só um segundinho. Prontinho, cá estou eu. Né? Neste momento, eu tenho a oportunidade de lecionar justamente uma disciplina de psicopatologia, né? E no curso de psicologia, no curso da graduação de psicologia, né? E você havia comentado a respeito do Frantz Fanon, um autor que também no Brasil, embora seja de extrema importância, muito salutar, né, para a produção do nosso pensamento crítico, também é um autor que muitos de nós não tivemos nas nossas graduações e até mesmo nas nossas pós-graduações, né? Não é exatamente uma pergunta, é somente um comentário. Nós também estamos vendo agora uma onda muito importante de retorno a este pensador, e inclusive dentro dos campos da psicologia analítica, da psicanálise, da fenomenologia, né? Antes tarde do que nunca. Né? Eu sinto que estamos tendo aqui uma conexão, muito embora a situação seja realmente muito precária no nosso país, né? Eu sinto que é uma articulação que a gente começa a desenvolver a partir de agora, né? E mais particularmente para que a gente consiga refinar essa escuta, né? Particularmente um elemento social, comunitário da nossa escuta. E esse, sem dúvidas, é um desafio muito grande. Hoje mesmo, inclusive, terminando a palestra, eu vou começar a discussão de Frantz Fanon exatamente dentro de um campo da psicopatologia. Não no sentido de que ele é um autor, né, que vai descrever nosograficamente os quadros, mas como uma figura muito insuspeita dos próprios movimentos, né, de desinstitucionalização, né, toda uma outra forma de se observar, né, saúde mental, de se praticar clínica, dessa perspectiva que eu acho que você traz para nós, né? E eu sempre fico muito curioso de saber, né, de que forma a gente poderia introduzir isso de uma maneira, digamos, mais palatável para os nossos alunos, que frequentemente chegam com uma expectativa de que o trabalho clínico do psicólogo realmente está restrito a um âmbito privado, né? De certo modo, um pedido de ajuda, né? De que outras formas mais a gente poderia, né, trazer, talvez, alguns outros elementos. Martim Baró, eu vi que você acabou de escrever aqui, outro autor muito importante, né, na nossa formação, e outro que eu também acredito que está fazendo parte dessa onda, né, talvez de uma, como eu digo, né, desburguesização da nossa educação, né, formal de psicólogos e também prática. E no mais, eu queria agradecer muito. Tive a oportunidade de, no passado, ler o seu Waking Dreams. Eu acho que é um dos livros mais eloquentes e ricos que eu já tive a oportunidade de conhecer. Adoraria um dia ter a oportunidade de traduzi-lo. Né? Um grande abraço, um grande beijo. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Daniel. I do have some things to add here. And what you're bringing up is very important. The way that we teach psychopathology must be changed. And for me, the first person who was critically impactful for me was Arthur Kleinman. He is a psychiatrist and an anthropologist and a psychiatric epidemiologist who has worked in several different cultures and very deeply in China. So in the 80s, he came out with this book, Rethinking Psychiatry, where he says, as a psychiatric epidemiologist, if he looks at prevalence of psychological disorder and psychological suffering, you can begin to make sense of it by the kinds of things that people have been living through. So he said, instead of talking about psychopathology, we need to talk about social misery, because things like forced migration, violence at every level, from domestic violence all the way to genocide, racism, sexism, living not only poor, but poor people who are living right next door to those with excess resources. These kinds of social situations, and he lists quite a few of them, are what give rise to the most psychological suffering. So he says, if we look at the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, what we will see there in the description of the character disorders is not some kind of universal description that is applicable to all cultures, but it's applicable mainly to Western Europe and the United States, and to places where these two kinds of cultures have gained root in other parts of the world. And so that we need to read those as a kind of autobiography, rather than as something that is true for all people. So this is quite in line with Frantz Fanon and also Martin Baró. Martin Baró created the term psychosocial trauma. So what we call collective trauma or psychosocial trauma is trauma not suffered by a single individual. Certainly trauma is suffered by individuals, but the kind of trauma that whole communities are subject to for certain situations, including, for instance, the situation we have here in the United States of Flint, Michigan, where people's children were drinking lead-contaminated water for years, while people in power actually knew and didn't care. that kind of feeling that a whole community goes through of being discounted and disregarded, as though your children can be poisoned because they don't really matter. So they both wanted to underline that we need to shift our attention to psychosocial and collective trauma, because in those we can speak to individuals who have suffered those all day long about their parents, but in order to get at the pillars of what have held these situations up, we need to begin to think more psychosocially and historically often. Frantz Fanon was given the directorship of a mental hospital in Algeria during the Algerian Revolution, Leidville. And in the morning, he would see people, Algerians, native Algerians who had been subjected to police violence and torture. And in the afternoon, he would see police people and people from the French army who had been driven insane by the torture and assassinations they had committed. And after trying to introduce various reforms that he had learned from a man named Tosquel in France into the hospital, he resigned. And you should Google his resignation letter, because he says essentially it's fruitless to try to heal people in a situation where the society is essentially tearing apart their psyche through the way that they're being treated. So again, there's a dance that we need to take as psychologically minded practitioners between listening very closely to trauma as experienced by individuals, and also taking a step back to really be a voice in our societies about the conditions that must be changed if we are not to keep generating individual trauma as a result of psychosocial trauma.
Mary, muito obrigado pela resposta.
Ótimo. Obrigado, Mary. Daniel, obrigado pela participação. Dani Lascani quer fazer uma pergunta. Dani, contigo.
Oi, Mary. Ai, é uma honra estar aqui te ouvindo. Agradeço muito essa oportunidade de te ouvir. E a minha pergunta, acho que vai um pouco nessa linha do desafio, assim como a do Marcos, que, né, assim, o capitalismo ele tem uma característica, né, muito própria, que é que transforma tudo, né, tudo que existe em produto, em relações de objeto, né? Isso repercute claramente na nossa sociedade. O que a gente vê, a gente colhe muitas consequências disso, né? Hoje na nossa sociedade, na forma como a gente se relaciona com as pessoas, com as coisas, com os outros seres, né? E eu fico aqui pensando se você considera, né, o capitalismo em si necrofílico, né? E se há outras opções para o capitalismo, ou se, né, assim, e qual é o nosso papel enquanto sociedade que usufrui de produtos dessa forma de viver, sem a gente cair em saídas, né, entre aspas, aí, que sejam, né, assim, que sejam nostálgicas, ou que a gente queira voltar para um passado, para alternativas que a gente já viveu na história. é um desafio. Como que você enxerga aí outras possibilidades?
That's an excellent question, Daniela. Thank you so much. There may be forms of capitalism that are less pernicious, but I think capitalism gives rise to many distorted forms of relationship between people and the environment. Ignacio Martín Baró, who I really want to bring your attention to if you don't know his work already. Strangely, today was the day when one of the people involved in his assassination were brought to justice in Spain. But he was a Jesuit who was also a social psychologist and worked in El Salvador during the conflicts there. And he said that one of the challenges to us as psychologists is to understand excess greed. And I think we have failed to do that so far. That we can see the destruction of excess greed in both the bioregions that we live, in the relationships between people in our cities and towns, in the differential access to critical life resources that people have. But I believe that one reason we have failed to be able to create enough insight about it is that our own work as psychologists is embedded in capitalism. And that it also distorts our relationships with people that we're trying to help. And that's a difficult thing to say, because I know we need to make a living also. And I know many of us, it's not like you're making a huge living, life is difficult. But one thing I notice is that when we charge for services, the more we charge, oftentimes, the more we feel we need to be an expert. And we need to treat other people as though we are an expert, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to justify their paying us for something like deep listening or accompaniment. I think in the public practice of psychology, I've been borrowing this word from the South, accompaniment. And sometimes I say psychosocial accompaniment or eco-psychosocial accompaniment. And one of the virtues of accompaniment is that it's a more horizontal activity where there's a mutuality involved of listening and learning. And that doesn't mean that there isn't help that's experienced, but hopefully not in like a very big differential of power and control. And so I think we can experiment with forms of going outside capitalism in ways that we practice our psychological mindedness. And in fact, we can have a foot in both worlds where when people pay us for analysis, that also funds us being able to do other kinds of projects. And I will remind you that Freud, in order to be part of the International Association of Psychoanalysis, Freud required that all analysts work either a day a week for free at a free clinic, or give a day's worth of wages to the free clinics that were present around 1917 after the First World War in Vienna and Berlin. And that's something that most people have really gotten away from. But it would be a way of our working also a little bit outside of the capitalist frame. Now, many small communities coming into existence too, trying to experiment with different forms of economies, and particularly different different and less destructive relationships to the environment. I've been struck in my graduate program, I would say a quarter to a third are young people trying to be involved in environmental justice and eco-psychology and creating sanctuaries and what Phil Berrigan, Thich Nhat Hanh called communities of resistance that are like little seeds for alternative ways of living. And in the graphics of the Zapatista movement, sometimes they'll have maps of the world with little stars where those kind of communities of resistance exist, and the idea is that someday maybe those stars will begin to merge so that we have regions where there is freedom from the extractive and destructive aspects of capitalism. Much more needs to be said about all that, but thank you for opening up the question, and certainly others, please chime in if you like.
Obrigado, Mary. Obrigado, Dani. Temos 3 perguntas, Patrícia, Carmen e Kátia, tá? Vamos na ordem. Patrícia, por favor.
Boa tarde, Mary. Um prazer poder te ouvir. Foi agora?
Foi.
Boa tarde, Mary. Um prazer te ouvir. Ficaria dias e horas aqui te ouvindo. Muito obrigada pela tua fala. Eu queria pegar uma carona na fala da Dani, pensando um pouco no capitalismo. Não quero saber se você é otimista ou pessimista diretamente, né? Mas eu tenho uma atividade nas ruas de São Paulo e sou uma apaixonada pelas cidades. E a gente tem observado aqui em São Paulo, principalmente, né? As pessoas estão saindo das cidades, né? Assim, sei que na Flórida também, hoje uma paciente me contou que está tendo uma saída, né? As pessoas procurando casas, cidades menores, né? Depois da pandemia. E acho que a pandemia trouxe, né, Mary? Acho que a tua fala aponta para isso, né? Essa questão social, né? Da pandemia mostrou o abismo que a gente vive, né? Assim, entre os mais favorecidos e os menos. E a tua fala me levou a pensar, né? Tenho trabalhado muito essa ideia do contato, né? Do medo do vírus, né? Da máscara que protege versus a máscara como muro, né? A tua fala me levou a pensar que será que estamos todos atrás das nossas máscaras, né, mais protegidos? Então eu fico pensando se vai ter um fracasso do social, né? Assim, a Paulista, nos últimos anos, a gente tinha a Paulista Aberta, que é uma avenida super movimentada, aos domingos tinha algo mais democrático, né? Uma rua mais habitada, né? As pessoas mais na rua, as cidades mais vivas. E São Paulo está triste, né? Assim, é uma cidade em que 6, 7 horas, assim, a questão da segurança volta a ser uma questão muito temerosa para as pessoas, né? Cidades muito vazias. Então, queria te ouvir um pouquinho, o que você imagina, né? O que vai acontecer? Será que a gente consegue atravessar, né? Sem se isolar tanto, né? Então, fiz essa brincadeira na minha cabeça, né? Máscara como muro, né? E o perigo disso. Então, muito obrigada pela tua fala e fiquei aqui pensando nessa ideia dos muros, né? Os muros cada vez mais levantados em relação à pandemia. Muito obrigada.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, very, very similar here. So in the big cities, people with wealth, often with, more than one home, left quite quickly. And I know this from my knowledge of New York City, and left behind the essential workers. And now, recently, in terms of hope, I heard of a conversation between environmental justice activist Carl Anthony and a friend Dennis Rivers, who are trying to imagine, as as our cities become absent of commercial spaces, like I don't know in your cities, but our stores are closing up, our big stores, our small stores are going out of business. And so they were trying to think in a positive light about how to convert that space into housing that could perhaps finally solve our homeless crisis. Our homeless crisis is extreme in California, very extreme in New York, many, many places. But the abyss we experience because some people have the freedom to come and go and others don't. And so the people who had the freedom to come and go actually ended up taking the virus into the countryside. They were trying to go to the most isolated places, and it was only a matter of months before those isolated places became the hotspots in the United States for the virus. Now we have this struggle around teachers. Should teachers be forced to go back into the classroom? And you know, again, like people who must work out of their home are at much, much higher risk than those of us like myself today. I'm sitting in my study. I haven't been to my campus in 7 months because I have the privilege to be here. So we must attend to, you know, creating solidarity across these metaphorical walls. In whatever ways we can. And I see many ways that people are attempting to do that. But it must happen on a massive scale because of the number of problems that have been brought up. Thank you.
Obrigada.
Obrigado, Pati. Beijo. Carmen, contigo. Tá aí, Carmen?
Ai, desculpa, o microfone estava desligado. Estão me ouvindo?
Baixinho, tá bem baixo.
Melhorou?
Melhorou.
Mary, agradeço muito a tua fala, obrigada. A tua fala me levou a pensar no quão iatrogênico pode ser essa psicologia excessivamente subjetivista que está desconectada do mundo, né? E com uma lógica muito de centro, que exclui as lógicas periféricas, né? Atualmente eu tive uma experiência aqui na pandemia de supervisionar um grupo que estava atuando nas periferias. E o grupo tinha sido chamado por uma ONG porque as pessoas estavam muito ansiosas, né? Mas quando a gente foi ouvir a ansiedade dessas pessoas, o que aconteceu foi que elas não tinham certeza se elas iam ter água para poder lavar as mãos, né? Se o caminhão-pipa ia abastecer a comunidade. Elas não sabiam se iam ter vaga em hospital, caso elas tivessem a Covid. Quando os parentes delas tinham a Covid, elas não sabiam, elas só sabiam deles quando eles saíam de alta ou então quando eles morriam, né? E elas tinham muito medo porque as casas tinham cerca de 30 a 40 metros quadrados, às vezes moravam 9 pessoas. Oi.
Roberto, tá o microfone aberto.
Aberto. Então, o que aconteceu, né, é que assim, isso era visto como se ainda por cima essas pessoas fossem culpadas por estarem ansiosas, né? E a nossa intervenção ali foi muito pensar e elas se sentiam muito invisíveis e muito impotentes. E a gente estava pensando ali de que forma que a própria comunidade, então, poderia fazer para se ajudar, né? O agente comunitário passar de casa em casa, a gente mobilizar uma pessoa do hospital que pudesse dar notícias diárias dos parentes, a escola funcionar como um acampamento para doentes, não sei, né? Já que ela estava fechada, enfim. Porque a gente estava pensando que isso era uma lógica de trabalho muito mais pertinente do que ainda por cima culpabilizar como se tivesse algo errado, uma ansiedade que estava muito bem colocada, né? Então, queria que você comentasse um pouco quanto pode ser iatrogênico, né? Nesse sentido. A gente levar uma clínica, uma lógica de clínica particular.
Thank you very much. It occurs to me that there's a confluence between some of what I was speaking about earlier and this issue. What we saw in the early history was a progressive criminalization of groups of people that was inappropriate. For instance, in England, you know, the separation of the deserving poor from the undeserving poor, and then criminalizing the undeserving poor, placing them in prisons. We've in the United States criminalized forced migrants, for instance. In psychiatric diagnosis, we're not criminalizing, but we're psychopathologizing people. People who are living in very difficult circumstances, of course, feel deep depression and anxiety, and sometimes are even pushed into the brink of kind of psychotic states. But once we make those diagnoses, and this is a point that comes again from Arthur Kleinman, we tend to forget what were the situations that they were suffering that gave rise to these feelings, and we begin to treat the feeling themselves. So he gives the example of working with victims of torture. That for the immigrant who is a victim of torture to get help in the United States, unless they're able to get to a clinic that specializes in that, they have to get into a private practice or a public clinic and receive a diagnosis. And then the treatment that they receive is based on their diagnosis. Now, it may be that they were an incredibly courageous person. Perhaps they were in solidarity with a community of people. Perhaps they had laudable leadership qualities. And suddenly now they're a psychiatric patient. So he says, you know, we've belittled the totality of the person by disregarding the context. And so I'm just thinking there's something about criminalizing people and psychopathologizing them. And that doesn't mean, I know sometimes to get a diagnosis on what one's suffering can be extremely helpful. It can give you a little anchor so you can figure out what you're going to do. But oftentimes it doesn't work that way. And what I'm witnessing in the US, sadly, is that young people are being taught to the diagnosis and not to the social context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Obrigado, Carmen. Kátia e depois a Sônia Alabate, por favor.
Olá, boa tarde, Mary. Agradeço que você tenha trazido um contexto político para o debate da psicologia junguiana. Considero muito importante, principalmente nesse momento que nós estamos passando aqui no Brasil, além da pandemia, né? Como o Marcos comentou, o governo é muito totalitário. Eu queria te perguntar se você conhece o movimento QAnon que está acontecendo aí, que é um tipo de um anônimo que criou uma teoria conspiratória sobre abuso, pedofilia, e um herói, então, né, que vem a ser o Trump para salvar a todos. E esse tipo de fake news, que tem uma influência muito grande, consegue mobilizar uma população e criar, né, uma irrealidade muito fantástica. E eu gostaria muito se você pudesse comentar sobre isso, porque é algo que tem me deixado bastante aterrorizada, sabe? Em termos psicológicos né? Da imaginação caminhando por aí, sabe? Seria isso.
Yeah. Well, it's disturbing me too. It's disturbing me so much that I have not been able to look into it as much as I ought to. But what I can say is that the kind of abysses that we're talking about also become abysses between what kind of news people are receiving. And right now we have, you know, whole populations that are receiving news that isn't news, that's filled with conspiracy and really falsehood, with lies. And the people who are spreading it, you know, are not just in the United States. They're also in other countries in an attempt to destabilize. This is quite clear. The FBI and the CIA are quite clear on this. But for the so, I mean, I alluded in the beginning of my talk that this had been quite a learning curve for me. And the part that I left out was I was trying to understand, before the pandemic struck, more about several groups of white people in the US who are supportive of the move toward fascism. And the two groups in particular are that I was looking at is poor white people without a BA who are often struggling with insecure housing and employment, who are unemployed or underemployed. And a sizable proportion of that subpopulation is has lost all hope or trust in the government, and was seduced by Trump's rhetoric. And even though Trump could not be more different from them, you know, he was brought up quite wealthy. They heard him speaking to the shame that they feel in the eyes of the people of the middle and upper class who live in the Northeast and in the West of the United States. So we have left over from the Civil War these deep conflicts, and with many poor white Americans, a deep sense that they've been belittled and shamed. And Trump really spoke to that, and Hillary Clinton helped by calling them deplorables before the election. That was a really terrible moment. The other group is extremely wealthy people who used to be Democrat, who have changed over to being Republican, because in fact it's quite beneficial financially for them. And they are also part of news networking that brings these conspiracy theories into the public ear. But you know, the news that I watch and the news that another group of people watches and the news that a third group of people watch, it can be completely different. And while there was always some of that in the US, it is much, much worse right now. And particularly vis-a-vis the demonstrations that are happening, which are by and large peaceful demonstrations, but now are being villainized as, you know, trying to bring the government down, which is not the point. That was not the point of them. Sonia, so good to see your face. Hi, Gilberto.
Oh, how are you?
Very good. Sonia has been like another mother to my Brazilian daughter. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Eu vou falar em português para a tradutora poder traduzir para você. Em primeiro lugar, quero dizer que estou com muita saudade de você e é um prazer enorme te ver.
I miss you too.
E
thank you. You too.
Nós estamos todos vivendo nessa época tão pessimista do ponto de vista político e dessa pandemia, mas eu conheço o trabalho que você vem fazendo e que eu gostaria que você contasse para esse grupo, que é o trabalho de mediação entre populações que entraram em guerra civil e depois no processo de paz, e um pouco também da sua formação numa escola que valorizava muito o pacifismo, porque isso, você tem tantas facetas na sua personalidade, no seu trabalho, e eu tenho acompanhado isso ao longo dos anos, sempre com muita admiração com tudo que você faz. Então, eu queria que você contasse esse aspecto mais positivo desse trabalho que você faz, para dar um pouquinho de esperança para a gente.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you for all the favors you've done me over the years. Well, I moved to California 25 years ago from the Northeast and arrived at a town, a city that I couldn't understand. I had spent very little time here. And these years have given me an opportunity to learn much more about my city. And during that time, for a while, I was very interested in peace building and reconciliation in other parts of the world. And it was actually an encounter I had in Chiapas, Mexico, that changed that. I was accompanying a group of young people from the United States to the Zapatista communities for a few weeks of learning Zapatismo. And the Zapatistas, in trying to create these alternatives to capitalism, invite international visitors to apply to come and live with them for a little while. And you don't live in their community. There are special spaces set up for you because they are finished with having people invade their communities. But they say to you very clearly, particularly if you're from the United States, thank you for coming, thank you for learning. We don't need your help here. We need you to go back to your own country and do the work there that is making life here so miserable for us. So I realized that in my community, it's a virtual apartheid between about 60% Anglos and 40% people of Mexican and Mexican-American descent. So we may as well have a wall here, but we have metaphorical walls in all sorts of ways: schooling, housing, healthcare, etc. So I began to affiliate myself with a beautiful organization, a Latinx organization called Pueblo, that is now called Cause, and just began to go to their meetings and see what the situation was for people that I generally am not in contact with. And this would be an example of a stage of what I call accompaniment, of, in this case, like immersion, learning, listening. And after about a year, one of the young women said, I have a dream. I would like to do an oral history about the lived experience of people in Santa Barbara who are living here without immigration documents. And if anybody would like to help with that, please let me know. Well, I knew something about how to do oral history, so I volunteered. And we spent the next 2 years in very close conversation. The group of young people that came together to work on it, all were here in the US without documents themselves, and their family members, for the most part, were undocumented. And that was this was about 13 years ago, a very difficult time here because of a new set of laws that had been brought in that were very difficult, made life extremely difficult for people without documents. So they interviewed their neighbors, their family members, they interviewed each other, they figured out how to extract the themes and to create a book about their their experience. And the reason they wanted to do it was to build empathy with the Anglo community, because in everyday interactions, Anglos were just looking past them or treating them as servants and not curious about their lives and the difficulties and the hopes and joys of their lives. And so once we got the book, it became a way for them to create conversation in churches, synagogues, schools, community settings where the young people would go, and within a more intimate setting, they would tell their own story, or if that was too dangerous in terms of feeling exposed in the community, they would tell the story of one of the other members of the committee. And in this way, we were involved in some peace building, I think, within our own local community between people of very different economic means, different ethnic background, and different citizenship status. That led to a series of events that were about what we call border immersion. At that period, it was very difficult to have border immersion experiences in Mexico because of the level of violence, and organizations that had been doing that, helping American citizens know more about the horrible situation on the border, asked people in cities and towns to create education between their immigrant population and their citizens. So between citizen neighbors and non-citizen neighbors, and to really build a sense of neighborship between these two groups. So that's the work that that I did for many years here, which once Trump was elected, I realized that, so in New York, that takes the form of you often accompany people who are going to immigration hearings at the Federal Plaza in New York City, because their own family members can't go with them if they don't have documents. They're afraid of being apprehended and imprisoned. And yet, if your family member goes to immigration court and becomes imprisoned, somebody needs to be able to interface with the family so they'll know where that person is. So I was doing that kind of work. And then when Trump was elected, I realized that when they started taking the children away from the parents and separating them, that I needed to use my skills as a psychologist to do psychological evaluations to try to get people out of the detention centers more quickly so they could reunite with their children. So that work, it's you know, you can't talk about the specificity of that work, but I try in public settings like this to give some sense of what people are suffering inside, and in that way being a kind of hopefully doing some reconciling between two very, very different worlds. So that's a little bit about peace building at home. I think in our own communities, we have many possibilities for making connections, building bridges between people, which is very, which is a joy in our own lives. And so here I will touch on hope and joy. Obviously, naive hope is not helpful to us. We have to have what Paulo Freire would call a radical hope at this moment. A hope based on our vision, on the enunciation of what it is we want to have come forward from this time. What have we learned from this time to help us make our situation, our neighborhoods, our cities better? I struggled with my publisher on my latest book called Mutual Accompaniment and the Creation of the Commons to get the word mutual in the title. She didn't understand why that was a make it or break it situation until I was able to be more articulate about it. I think when we're in situations of accompaniment like the ones I'm describing, there's a deep healing that happens for us because, as Derrida so beautifully put it, we're locked out of our home when we don't have a relationship to our neighbors. And when we can make that relationship, even if it's fleeting, like for me, 3 hours with a person, I can be in a very stark and inhuman setting in these prisons, but we have each other and we're in dialogue and we're talking about things that are important and pointing toward a future that will be different. So I can say quite paradoxically, and this is so also of work I do in prison, that there is a kind of a joy that you feel in that kind of connection, which I'm sure many of you have had the grace to experience. And it gives you some hope. It's not a naive hope, but it's a deep faith that develops in other humans, and a faith in their sacred nature, and in the possibility of being with and alongside in ways that can create solidarity in this kind of a time. So thank you for your question. Very good to see you.
Muito obrigada, foi uma delícia.
Obrigado.
Quero te encontrar de novo logo.
Mary, queria fazer 2 perguntas para a gente poder fechar o nosso debate. Ao te ouvir, eu criei uma teoria aqui que eu queria saber se é um delírio que eu tive ou se faz algum sentido para você. Fiquei pensando que esse livro teu continua nesse. Ou seja,
Yes.
Será que os convidados imaginais que você, nesse livro, nos fala que nós devemos reconhecer, aproximar, dialogar com eles, não são esses mesmos convidados imaginais que hoje nos estão bloqueados pelos muros? Quer dizer, os muros não nos permitem mais. Não é um delírio, então? Faz sentido?
No, see, I started really because of my own situation, being young, trying to understand my mother, trying to understand myself, having these in-breaks of waking dreams. I started trying to understand, and my understanding, as I turned to Jungian psychology, pointed me inside. And so developed this practice of active imagination and developed, an understanding of how you create imaginal dialogue. And I saw it as a healthy part of active imagination, because a lot of times when people are suffering, say, for instance, hallucination, they're experiencing the voice telling them what to do, commanding them. And it's not a horizontal, mutual relationship where there's learning going on both sides, but actually in active imagination, you can strive to have these more listening, learning relationships with each other. And I think in many ways, this was the spirit that James was imparting to us, that we should get to know these others, these imaginal others. And so quite dedicated to that. But then I began to, I had the hypothesis, and I think I drew this from Jung, that the capacity to have this kind of internal dialogue with oneself would have positive influence on one's capacity to have dialogue with others. And that Jung's often emphasis on you have to do the internal work before you do the external work. I heard it all through the Jung Institute. But I began to think that this was wrong because, first of all, I saw many people older than myself doing a lot of imaginal dialogue, but almost no talking with people outside their very small group of friends or family. and being quite preoccupied by the imaginal and spending lots and lots of hours writing down everything and year after year journal, books, etc. But when they were in places with other people, I didn't see that they had any kind of superior capacity for dialogue that was coming out of all of this. And then I realized that, well, if that was so, then the inner work and the outer work can't be staged, with the inner work happening first, because there's lots of things that we need to learn about ourselves that we only learn about in relationship to other people, and particularly in relationship to other people who are unlike ourselves, who have been brought up differently, who have different values, who experience different challenges and joys. And so I realized at some point, and there are some writings on my website about this, that you can begin to try to nourish dialogue in many, many different settings, you know, in preschool, in relationship to an artwork that you're creating, with a child that you have, between yourself and a friend, yourself and a neighbor, etc., yourself and imaginal others. But the issue is how to like bring those capacities of dialogue across more different kinds of scenarios, so that you're not using one to defend against the other, really. Freire, you know, doesn't really talk much about imaginal dialogues, but he does talk about imagination in terms of what he's calling enunciation and the kind of dreaming of a world with others. And that's something I've really borrowed a lot on from his work, that when we're looking at our dreams and our imaginal life, one pathway is in through nightly dreams and active imagination. Another is to join with people and to dream publicly, to dream in relationship to each other's images, you know, and certainly social dreaming is one pathway into that. I think that the pedagogy, the theater of the oppressed that we are so thankful to Brazil for is another pathway into that. But so I don't see any contradiction between the earlier work and the later work, although I don't think I was able in the early work to be able to clarify that. So I've tried to go back in new prefaces to those two books to underline the continuity of the necessity for dialogue across different kinds of spaces.
Ótimo, obrigado. Queria te fazer uma última pergunta. Nós vamos ganhar do Trump?
Is what?
Se nós vamos do Trump. Das eleições.
What's the translation?
Não, se nós, democratas,
Oh, yes. Well, we must. We must. I mean, all forces are out. Yeah, no, it's what everybody is thinking about. And actually, you see an uncommon coming together of people across different political persuasions to make sure this happens, because so much has been destroyed in these years. It's really, I mean, it's breathtaking every day, more and more evidence of destruction for people and animals and places and rivers. And most people never could have predicted it. I know after 9/11, there were some voices. I think of Susan Griffin as being one who said that she felt that we were going to be floating toward fascism. Floating isn't the right word there. And And she was completely correct. And here we are, you know, we're you know, threats of not even being able to have an election in the United States, unbelievable. So pray for us, we'll pray for you. I want to thank you all so much for this opportunity. Whenever I have the chance to be in a group with Brazilian people, I'm so moved by your warm-heartedness and generosity. You know, you've done my heart good today by being with you, and I really want to thank you. I'm going to have a class online at Pacifica on liberation psychology. If any of you want to join, let me know. I think it's the time we can do lots of learning online while we stay at home. So thank you so much.
Mary, queria muito te agradecer. A recíproca também é absolutamente verdadeira. Para nós ter você junto a nós, trazendo a figura do Paulo Freire, um personagem que anda sendo tão maltratado atualmente pelo governo brasileiro, trazendo questões tão próximas à nossa realidade brasileira. Você, sem dúvida, é uma fonte de grande inspiração para o nosso trabalho. Muito obrigado pela tua presença e pela troca que você estabeleceu com a gente. Obrigado.
Thank you. Bye-bye.